Hello, everyone. Turn to 1 Samuel. I got the text late yesterday afternoon from Mike Prince, who is supposed to be standing up here today, but Mike is ill and unable to come, so you're stuck with me today. My apologies for that. But we're going to jump into the historical books that, if you are familiar with your Old Testament, this is a very fun and exciting section of the Old Testament. Last week, you saw how God blessed the faithfulness of Ruth, and the events of her life happened during the era of the Judges. So, during the time of what's happening in the book of Judges, Ruth happens. It's not after, it's during. And today, we're going to be introduced to the last judge. His name is Samuel, the final judge. And he will be the bridge into the kingdom of Israel. And that will come here really soon with Saul coming onto the scene and then King David. We skipped over several accounts in the book of Judges. And if you've never read Judges, you need to. Go back through it, read the book of Judges. It won't take you long. It's not a long book. But that will help you get the big picture of what was going down during those 300 years. It's about 300 years that's covered in the book of Judges. So a pretty decent historical period. 1 Samuel is part of the historical section of the Old Testament. It covers about 95 years over the course of this little story here with him. And I had to double check it. When he sent me the text, I pulled up, this is a curriculum from Answers in Genesis, and I pulled up the curriculum, and the curriculum actually calls for you to take a couple of moments and read the first 3 chapters of 1 Samuel. So that's what we're going to do. I'm just going to stop talking for a few minutes and take a couple of minutes and read 1 Samuel 1, 2, and 3. It won't take you long, but read those 3 chapters, and then we'll talk through some of those things together. 1, 2, 3, go. Now, those 3 chapters, you just read 3 chapters. If you did that every single day, you'd read through the Bible every year. So there you go. Didn't take you long, did it? That's all it takes to read through the Bible once a year. 3 chapters-ish a day. Now, not all chapters are created equal. Some are bigger than others, Psalm 119 has 176 verses. It's the longest one in the Bible. Psalm 117 has 2 verses. It's the shortest one in the Bible. It takes you about 10 seconds to read that chapter. It takes you 15 to read Psalm 119. But if you did, on average, 3 chapters a day, all the way through, there are 1,189 chapters in your Bible. So, 3 a day. And away you go. So there's obviously more in these 3 chapters than we could cover in hours of discussion. So we'll focus on just a couple of things. We're going to focus on Samuel and his response to God. We're going to focus as well on God's judgment on Eli and on Israel. So let's ask some questions as we do and engage a little bit. How does Samuel wind up in service to God and to Eli in Shiloh? Yeah, his mother promised that if she were to have this child, she was barren. If she were to have this child, she would dedicate him to the Lord. He would serve the Lord forever there. What a good mom to do that, especially after a season of infertility and barrenness, to then say, I will give this child to God to serve there in Shiloh. I'm sure that was very difficult for her to do. What do Hannah's actions and her prayer in chapter 2, what does that tell us about Hannah? Just in general. Yeah, she's very devoted to him, isn't she? Her whole heart is with him. Yeah, we like Hannah. You know, you read through all this like, oh, she's fantastic. We love her with all that she's done. Now, there's an interesting comparison that you can make between Samuel and Jesus. There's a lot going on there, a lot of parallels that you can see. In fact, we'll talk about one or two over our time together. And part of that comparison is comparing Hannah and Mary. If you read Mary's song, known as the Magnificat, which is the first word of the song in Latin, my soul magnifies the Lord, so Magnificat. It is shockingly similar to Hannah's song in 1 Samuel 2. They're very closely related. They say a lot of similar things about God and his faithfulness. In fact, we sing a song based on 1 Samuel 2 here. Holy is the Lord. There is no one holy like our God. We didn't sing it today. That would have been nice if that had worked out, but we didn't sing that today. But it comes right out of Hannah's prayer in chapter 2. So we appreciate Hannah's faith. She recognizes the truth of who God is, his holiness, his sovereign power, his faithfulness. Again, she understands even in her distress who had closed her womb. God had. She acknowledges who has babies and who doesn't. God, that's up to you, even because you have the power to undo whatever issue that is. So we're praying for a baby and trusting in you at the same time. She can be quite an encouragement for someone going through whatever trial, especially if you're going through infertility. So who is Eli? What's his role? He's a priest. Right? He's one of God's priests. He's in Shiloh. Now, oddly, so the LSB will say that he served at the temple in Shiloh. Temple's a loose word to use. Tabernacle would be better. That the formal temple hasn't been built yet in Jerusalem, because the temple's not in Shiloh. The temple's in Jerusalem. Solomon will build that. So Saul's coming, then David, then Solomon. Solomon will build that temple, but it's called this because this is where the ark is, because that's going to come up. We're going to read into chapter 4 here in a little bit. So this is the temple where you go to worship God, but it's not the temple like what we're thinking of when we think of the temple in Jerusalem. What do we learn about Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas? Yeah, we don't like them. We like Hannah. We don't like these guys. They're wicked, they're evil in multiple ways. They're corrupt. They steal meat intended for sacrifice. Explicitly condemned in the law, the first 5 books of your Old Testament. God doesn't take to that kindly. These are for God. Now, they do get to eat of that. They do. That's how the sons of Levi are fed, and the sons of Aaron, the priests, is they eat what has been brought to the temple and to the tabernacle for sacrifices, but instead of giving the very best to God, they take the very best for themselves, which is stealing from God and dishonoring him. 2:29, so Eli's involved in some of this, right? So how would you rate Eli as a dad? Yeah, probably not great, right? So he's there. He's got the 2 sons. He knows they're doing this. Now, he does confront them. We'll give him that. Credit where it's due, right? He does confront the boys and tell them what they're doing is wicked and evil, that they shouldn't do this, yet he doesn't stop them. So the law would call for Eli to stone his sons to death. And he doesn't. So he puts his own children before God, a sin that Americans are really good at, putting their children before the Lord and letting them run the home and make the decisions. It's a huge challenge in our culture today. Family is absolutely idolatrous in our culture. And he seems to to be doing the same thing. We'll find out later in chapter 4 that Eli is really fat. Not necessarily a flattering thing for the Bible to say about him. He was really heavy. And in fact, that directly leads to his death. But the fact that he is so large indicates he's eating those choicest cuts of meat. So the only reason someone would get fat in a culture like this is if they're really, really wealthy or eating those choicest cuts of meat. There wasn't an obesity epidemic in ancient Israel. That implies some things about Eli and his life as he honored his sons above the Lord. So in contrast to Hophni and Phinehas, how is Samuel described in the verses? Because they are set in opposition to one another. How is Samuel described? Yeah, so that's 2:26, right? He grows in stature and favor with the Lord and with men. Does that sound familiar to you? Those same words are used of Jesus in Luke chapter 2, verse 52. Yeah, so again, there's parallels here. Jesus is the only other young boy described in those terms throughout Scripture, at least in that same way. So he's described in chapter 2, verse 18 as faithful. So he's faithfully serving God. He's doing what he's supposed to do when he's supposed to do it. Hophni and Phinehas are not doing that. So Samuel is already elevated now over the boys. So remember, all this stuff is generational. So Hophni and Phinehas will be the head priests after Eli dies. That's how it's supposed to go. And then their children will be the next, and then their children. It's all in the family line. So the Bible's already hinting at us God's going to undo that. He's going to destroy that in all of this, and he's going to take out those two boys and go in a different line with Samuel, and that line will now be cut off from the Lord and from service in his temple. God takes this stuff really seriously. So in chapter 2, there's this unnamed prophet who announces a judgment. What's the judgment? What's going to happen? Boop, dead. Both sons are going to die on the same day. The descendants are not going to retain the priesthood. How old do you think Samuel was when he receives this first vision from God, when he hears from God? It doesn't say a specific number. He's the boy, yes. So he hasn't grown up. There hasn't been this time warp, and he's now an adult. So he's a child, maybe a teenager. Most commentators would say he's likely in his teens that he hears from God. This is why we take kids ministry and student ministry so seriously. They're not the church of the next generation. They are the church of now. They are God's people now. We don't wait until they become adults to allow them to serve. Again, there were two teenagers on our stage today leading us in worship. We do that very much on purpose. That's when God begins to do these great works in the lives of his people, which is one of the great things about kids who grow up in Christian homes and are involved in good churches. God starts this work so much earlier in their life. There's not this sense of regret of, oh, I didn't come to understand this till I was 40. So much wasted time. If they maintain faithfulness to God, they won't ever have to say that. I mean, what a gift that is to them, that maybe your parents didn't give to you, but you're giving to the next generation. That's how it's supposed to go. And then they'll do that with their kids, and on it goes as we're faithful to the Lord and to them as we're introducing them to who God is at such a young age. Was any revelation from God common at the time? Now we're told that it's rare. So God's not speaking a lot. We take it for granted, don't we? If you want God to speak, all you have to do is open your Bible and read it. It's just that easy. We have the presence of God in us through his Spirit and the Word of God in our hand. You probably have 20 of them on your shelf at home. Some of us have more because we are ridiculous in the Bibles that we buy. And every time I get a new one, my wife says, so is that one different than the other ones? No, it says the same thing, but it's different. They do different things. Yeah, just whatever. Huh? That's right. Yeah. I mean, you open up those pages, there's nothing underlined, there's nothing in the margins. Yeah. I write cross references in the margins of mine, and then it's just ruined. So now I need a new one. It's so bright. Yeah. The pages aren't crinkled from me licking my finger and turning it. Man, the gilding is so shiny on the pages. Sorry, nerd stuff there. So we take this for granted. We have this constant revelation from God. He's always speaking. They did not have that. So there's very few visions. There's a priest. There's rare prophets. I mean, you might, over the course of your lifetime, had heard God's word from a prophet. It depends on where you lived and if you interacted with one of the prophets, and if you were obedient and made your way to Shiloh, to the tabernacle for the annual sacrifices and all that. If you did all that, you would interact with the priest. If you didn't, you don't. You wouldn't have that. They didn't have their own copies of what God said to the prophets. They didn't have their copies of Genesis through Deuteronomy. They didn't have the law in their house. So they had to rely on coming to these places to even hear what God had to say. To the point where when God speaks to Samuel in chapter 3, he doesn't know who that is. He thinks it's Eli calling him. Samuel, Samuel. And he goes and wakes up Eli. What do you want? Shut up and go back to bed. That wasn't me. And that's my translation because, do you like getting woken up by your kids in the middle of the night? No, you don't. Eli doesn't like that either. No, go back to sleep. That wasn't me. You're hearing stuff. And then finally, Eli picks up on, oh, this is God. The next time this happens, Samuel, speak, for your servant is listening. And he does, and then God gives this vision to him, and Eli wants to know what it is. Samuel doesn't want to tell him, because you're all going to die. That's understandable. And Eli responds, God can do whatever he wants. And the people begin to recognize Samuel in his role as a prophet, as a priest, and this will become clear that Dan in the extreme north, Beersheba being the extreme south, acknowledged Samuel as a prophet. Now the chapter break from chapter 3 to chapter 4 is very awkward. Now remember, there are no chapter breaks in the original. That was inserted in the 13th century by some well-meaning people. We're glad they did, for sure. But there are some places that the verse breaks and the chapter breaks are goofy, and they don't make that much sense. This is one of those. The storyline just continues on into chapter 4. But in 1, 2, and 3, there are some very stark contrasts between how some people respond to God versus others. There's Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas who aren't doing well, and there's Hannah and there's Samuel who are responding well. And God is faithful to direct what he's going to direct. So let's go to chapter 4, start in verse 1. Then thus the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out to meet the Philistines in battle and camped beside Ebenezer, and the Philistines camped in Aphek. The Philistines arranged themselves to meet Israel. Then the battle spread, and Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who struck down about 4,000 men on the battlefield. Then the people came into the camp, and the elders of Israel said, "Why has Yahweh defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us take to ourselves from Shiloh the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies." So the people went to Shiloh, and from there they carried the ark of the covenant of Yahweh of hosts, who sits above the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. And it happened that as the ark of the covenant of Yahweh came into the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth was thrown into confusion. Then the Philistines heard the noise of the shout and said, "What does the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" And then they knew that the ark of Yahweh had come into the camp, and the Philistines were afraid, for they said, "God has come into the camp." And they said, "Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us, who shall deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Be strong and become men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves of the Hebrews, as they've been slaves to you. Therefore become men and fight." So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent. And the slaughter was very great, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. And the ark of God was taken, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. They lose to the Philistines. Now remember, this is coming to the end of the era of the judges. So what's happening in the era of the judges? They're faithful to the Lord for a while, then they're not. And after a lengthy unfaithfulness to God, God will send in a foreign army to enslave them, subjugate them. And after however long of a period of time, Israel will cry out to God. God will raise up a judge and rescue them. Well, they're at one of those downward spirals again, and God sends in the Philistines. They've been enslaved to the Philistines. We don't know for how long. And they come in to battle and to fight, and they lose. And they decide, you know what we need? We need the Ark of the Covenant. Now, normally, that would be a good thing. You're familiar with it. We've read through all the Old Testament books up till now. Arise, O Yahweh. It's this battle cry as the ark would lead them out into battle and provide victory. And it's not because the Ark of the Covenant was some magical piece of furniture. It's because God dwelled there. And now they call for all of this in spite of their disobedience to the Lord, in spite of their unfaithfulness. They say, we need the Ark of the Covenant. But notice what they say, chapter 4, verse 3. Why has Yahweh defeated us today before the Philistines? So they acknowledge God defeated them, not even the Philistines. Let us take to ourselves from Shiloh the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. Not God, not he, it. They're treating the Ark of the Covenant like some magical talisman or some necklace they would wear around their neck for good luck. It's like a good luck charm. So we're going to just dishonor God and be unfaithful to him. So let's bring out the magic furniture and we're going to win. What a joke. God will not allow himself and his stuff to be abused by his own people for their selfish personal gain. So the ark goes, God doesn't go with it. And they are defeated, slaughtered, the word is used. For all that 30,000 of Israel's soldiers die. The ark is stolen, taken by the Philistines. Won't be the only time that happens. And then it's gone. And in the battle, the prophecy comes true. Hophni and Phinehas are killed on the same day. Go to verse 12. Now a man of Benjamin ran from the battle line and came to Shiloh the same day with his robes torn and dust on his head. And he came, and behold, Eli was sitting on a seat by the road, eagerly watching, because his heart was trembling for the ark of God. And the man came to tell it in the city, and the city cried out. Then Eli heard the noise of the outcry, and he said, "What does the noise of this commotion mean?" So the man came hurriedly and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes had set so that he could not see. The man said to Eli, "I am the one who came from the battle line. Indeed, I fled from the battle line today." And he said, "How did things go, my son?" Then the one who brought the news answered and said, "Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great slaughter among the people, and your two sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been taken." And it happened that when he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell off the seat backward beside the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for the man was old and heavy. Thus he judged Israel 40 years. Now his daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, was with child and about to give birth. And she heard the report that the ark of God was taken and that her father-in-law and her husband had died. So she kneeled down and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the women who stood by her said to her, "Do not be afraid, for you've given birth to a son." But she did not answer or pay attention. And she called the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God was taken, and because of her father-in-law and her husband." And she said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God was taken." So this section ends pretty darkly with what's happening. They lose the battle, the ark's taken, and now they come rushing back, and all of Shiloh cries out, and Eli hears of the death of his children, falls backwards, and is now dead as well. So all of the priests of God are dead, save one. Samuel is left. You will see this pattern over and over and over again as you read through the Old Testament. You have whoever God's anointed leader is, and as things are going south or God's going to make a move with that, he will raise up whoever's going to take their place. God is never without his plan. He's never without his anointed leader to come. Long before Saul is off the throne, he'd already risen up David and anointed him. And this Samuel, who survives all of this, and now becomes the prophet, the priest of Israel, the judge over Israel. So in a very short amount of time, we've got a barren woman who miraculously gives birth by God's power, who's now risen to become the leader over all of God's people. That same Samuel will be the one who will go and anoint Saul as king over Israel, the first king over Israel. He will also be the one who's commanded by God to go to that same king and tell him, "God has rejected you and withdrawn his spirit, his blessing, his favor from you." And it's Samuel who will go to the house of Jesse and assemble all of his sons and walk through them. And it's to Samuel that God will say, "Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart." And he will be the one to anoint David, the King of Kings over all Israel, who will then become this dramatic shift over. Again, a radical shift. This priesthood is dead. Now a new one in Samuel has arisen. This line with Saul and Benjamin has been killed off. His children are killed off. And David of the tribe of Judah now becomes the king. And he is the one to whom God will say, "Someone from your line will reign over my people forever." And that promise from 2 Chronicles chapter 7 will be the hope that we have in Christ, the eternal King who reigns over all things. It's this Samuel who gets to be the one on the front lines, there on the ground, to watch God do all of this massive transitioning among the leaders of his people. God used him for absolutely incredible things as he's the bridge from the judges and the priests to the king who will now lead God's people. So we've watched now as God continues to judge his people when they're unfaithful to him and they decide to be dismissive and pervert the worship of God. Again, God takes his holiness very seriously. We don't get to just do whatever we want. Even in terms of our worship of him, John's preaching next week on Psalm 15. That's what Psalm 15 is about. We don't just get to come into God's presence and do whatever we want. He kills people who do that. We come on his terms and on his terms alone. And he gets to decide who gets to come into his presence and when and how they come into his presence. But that and this transition from Samuel and into the kingdom of Israel, all that will come next week. Questions? Thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
Is it talk more about when they take the choice offerings from God for themselves? Does it talk, and it's mentioned more, I know that, but didn't I read that they were also seducing the women?
Yes.
One offense is against God.
Yep.
That's a more serious one, is it?
Sure. They're not only sinning vertically, they're also sinning horizontally, which is also a sin against God as well. So these young women who will volunteer to come and serve at the tabernacle in various ways, all of that, the priests of God who are to maintain holiness before the Lord are sleeping with them at the door to the tabernacle. But inside the tabernacle is the Ark of the Covenant. And they're committing adultery at the doorway.
And they're married.
Of course they are. Yeah. Yeah. So Phinehas' wife is pregnant. Yeah. So, I mean, the horrific nature of what even God's leaders are doing at the time, that gives you an indication of what's happening in Israel in general. If the leaders are doing this, the people are worse. That's just how it works. So it's always from the top down. So when the leader sets a tone of gross immorality, the people take license to go and do that as a nation. So this is bad stuff. This is a dark period of Israel's history because of that. Yes, ma'am?
Why did God just strike them dead right
Yeah, wouldn't that have been maybe a little bit more aggressive of God to do that he's just sick of it and wipes them all out? You've got one answer. That's a, why didn't God just kill him? That's such a good question, because I think when we read through the text, we ask that a lot. Why didn't God address this earlier? I mean, if he's so righteous and holy and just, he let this go for so long before he steps in and does something. Well, we've got his wise plan that he's doing what he's doing, regardless of our timeline or thoughts about it for sure. But this doesn't happen until Samuel's ready. He can't take them out until Samuel's ready. So he's maneuvering behind the scenes. And again, even in the Old Testament, God is merciful and gracious and kind. And we're grateful, because can you imagine if God were to do that? And there are times he does do that, right? He sees the sin, he just kills them all. We've seen it numerous times. We'll continue to see it. He'll just strike them dead and it's over. If he continued to be that way, none of us would be here. It's why we don't base our relationship with God on justice. We like justice. We cry out for justice. But we don't really want to stand before God and make our claim based on justice. Because if that's the case, we're all going to hell. Because that's justice. We make our claim based on mercy, that he wouldn't kill us. And in his kindness, he doesn't, because that's all we should get. So we get these glimpses of how kind God is, even in the midst of grotesque rebellion against him. He lets it go in the hopes that their eyes would be opened to the ridiculousness of what they've done. But they don't. So he does. Yep, sorry, I'm turning that way.
So that kind of goes along with my question. It's kind of, you can kind of see the plan, his
Yeah.
plan, because they actually took the ark. How many? That never works out when you touch the ark. You're not supposed to.
Right.
All gone.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So you see his plan. They take the ark. It never works out well for anybody who takes that ark, ever. So God will obliterate the Philistines because they have the ark. It will happen again. He'll break out the whole people group in tumors, to the point where they will make idols of gold of the tumors. And when they give the ark back, it's surrounded by all this gold. And God had sent a plague of mice in among them to devour all their crops, which is how you decimate and kill a culture in a farming society. And they'll make these golden mice that are, they give it back like, all right, we've made this God mad, so let's try to get some good favor. And even then, we'll see, as it comes back under King David, how serious God takes the ark. And you'll remember the story. They're walking with it. The ark is loaded improperly on a cart, supposed to be carried. So they've messed up the law, and they're walking, and one of the oxen pulling it stumbles, and the ark goes to fall. And this sweet, kind man, who's concerned about the glory of God and the ark, doesn't want it to fall into the dirt, reaches out his hand to touch it and steady it. And God does kill him on the spot for it. To the point it scares King David and says, I don't even want that in my city. Send it to the house of Obed-Edom and let him figure it out. And it goes onto his property, and that's where God will pour out his blessing on Obed-Edom. Yeah.
Question from the first hour.
Yeah.
Tie it together with this.
Mm-hmm.
As we see David coming in to the scene a little bit later.
Mm-hmm.
Very depressed because Saul's after him.
Yes.
Was that when he wrote Psalms 14, or was it later when he was old?
We don't know when he wrote Psalm 14. It could have been during any number of times. It certainly could have been when he's on the run from Saul.
It was during the Babylonian.
Well, so it will push towards that, yes. So I would argue this is towards the end of David's life, that he would write 14 as he looks at the land and sees the wickedness of Israel. That's certainly the case, because under David, there's sort of a golden age for Israel under David and Solomon for sure. That doesn't mean that everybody's all great and honoring of God. It doesn't. So there's some of those issues there, and it points towards the captivity and all of that with Babylon. Could have happened during Saul coming after him. Could have happened during Absalom's rebellion when he has to abdicate the throne and go on the run for his life. It could have been during any of those times, for sure. Yes, ma'am.
Was there only the tabernacle at Shiloh, or were there numerous tabernacles?
There's only one tabernacle, but then there are places of worship that they weren't supposed to have. It's called the high places, as you read through the Old Testament. So even the pagans worshipped up on the top of hills because you're closer to the heavens at that point. So you're getting closer to God as you go up. And one of the things we'll see as we get into the era of the kings is the good kings will destroy all the pagan altars, but most of them will leave the high places. Because once the tabernacle is established, that's the only place they're supposed to go to offer sacrifices. And they don't. They offer them elsewhere, and there's paganism involved in all of that. So they're not supposed to, but they do.
There's supposed to be one tabernacle.
One. They're supposed to go there because that is the physical representation of the presence of God. And he does physically dwell above the cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant. So when it's formed, back with Moses in the wilderness, the cloud comes down onto the tabernacle and it's finished, and the glory of God fills it.
So in Jesus' time, didn't they learn at the tabernacle? No.
They're at the temple by then. Yeah.
And that's
So the tabernacle is replaced by the temple, and they move the ark into the Holy of Holies. And now Jerusalem is the only place where you're supposed to come and worship. It's why the feasts are there. Nobody's going anywhere else. So this comes up in John 4 with the Samaritan woman at the well, and they have that conversation about where is it okay to worship. Jerusalem is the answer to that question. It's the only place they're supposed to go. But the Samaritans built their own in Samaria on Mount Gerizim, and that's condemned.
at that point in time, where did they go to worship? I mean, if
Jerusalem.
it's miles away,
Yeah.
but you can't do that weekly then.
No, so they went for the annual feasts alone.
That's the only time.
That's it. Yep. In the meantime, they're to honor the Sabbath on their own. But your formal relationship with God is taken care of during the feasts, and that's it. Yep. Then, in the intertestamental period, that 400 years between your Old and New Testament, that's when the synagogues will rise. There weren't synagogues in the Old Testament. So there's the temple in Jerusalem, then there's synagogues in all the cities out amongst the people. So they could go now to Sabbath worship. But that doesn't happen until after the Babylonian captivity, and they come back. And they realize we should probably do better at this, because when we don't, he sends us into foreign lands.
So that's when the synagogues.
That's when the synagogues come. That's when the Pharisees and the Sadducees rise. They didn't exist in the Old Testament. They all come in that 400-year period of time. The oral law comes into that same period of time, all in an effort to not go into captivity again. It started with good intention. They blew it, but it started with good intention. Yeah. All right, 1, 2, 3, go team. We got to go.